Welcome to my podcast, The Government Mechanic. I am your host, Dr. Kahn, and I am the Government Mechanic. My very special guest today on this episode number 2 is John Kamensky, and we are going to talk about government reform. Now, it's been 3 days since the 2024 elections, but we plan to have this conversation no matter who won the White House and who won all the other leadership positions. John, how's Washington, D.C.?
Well, let me focus on the beautiful weather we're having today. Today it's mid-November, where sky is clear, the temperature is pleasant, pleasing soft breeze.
I'm sure calmer than the chaos behind the scenes. John, let me introduce John. John Kamensky is a senior fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration. He worked for many decades for the IBM Center for the Business of Government, and he started looking at issues of government reform 50 years ago, 1974, at the Texas Constitutional Convention. So he's been looking at these issues for a very long time. I met John when he was a deputy director at the National Partnership for Reinventing Government, which was housed at the White House offices of the Vice President Al Gore. John, you have called Reinventing Government the longest running government reform effort in history, 8 full years. Can you describe how it was organized and what the goals were?
Sure. And thank you very much for inviting me to be on your podcast. There were a lot of moving parts to the Reinventing Government effort, that there were like 3 overarching themes that were involved in this. First of all, it was principle driven. It was based in part on David Osborne's book, Reinventing Government, which was the reinventing effort was organized around some of his themes. And his book detailed about 10 reinventing government principles. And his advice to us, though, was that nobody can remember more than 3 things. So we boiled everything down to 4 things that of which most people could remember 3. And they weren't always the same 3 that people remembered, but it was putting customers first, cutting red tape, empowering employees, and then cutting back to basics. We wrote this up on a gold card that we distributed as a little credit card size thing to like over 100,000 civil servants that we met over the course of the project. And we put the 10 items that Osborne had on the back of the card, and then on the front of the card, we had those 4 principles. And we did that because you can't issue detailed guidance to 2.2 million civil servants. You have to engage their creativity, but be really clear about what the compelling principles are and not threats. And we saw fascinating things happen on the front line that we could never have envisioned from Washington, such as hundreds of millions of dollars in savings at an energy research lab in Morgantown, West Virginia. We didn't ask them to do anything. They did this on their own because they said that met the principles that were on the card. We learned about their efforts long after they had already happened. In fact, the secretary of the department didn't even know about the savings that were occurring on the front line. The second thing is that we focused on reforms inside government to make it work better, not the how of government, of what government should be doing. I mean, we focused on the how, not on the what government should be doing. And we were encouraged by Vice President Gore to not focus on the what. He said that is the purview of political leaders and value judgments, not the role of civil servants. But the civil servants know how government works and where fixes needed to happen. So the other piece of advice that I thought was interesting from the vice president, he says, don't try to move the boxes in the government, fix what's inside the boxes. And I thought that was really good advice because in government, in the private sector, moving boxes tends to be one of your first activities. In government, it's like a last resort to do something. And if you look at the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, I mean, that took more than a decade to recover from all the chaos that resulted as a result of creating that department. The reinventing government effort did have some reorganizing proposals, even though we were trying not to do that. One of them was to turn the air traffic control operations in the Federal Aviation Administration into a private corporation or a government owned corporation. That never happened. It's still being talked about, but never happened. We also recommended merging immigration controls and the Customs Service, and that was something that was done with the Department of Homeland Security, and that's still been a problematic effort. And that was done under George Bush. The third um, big picture item in the theme was a overarching goal on how do you improve trust in government, and we had a focus that looked at improving customer service, and that's been an enduring theme over the past 30 years. It's been bipartisan. It continues today. In fact, there's legislation currently pending in Congress to create chief customer service officials in each of the different departments and agencies. So that's been a challenging work in progress. The thing that I thought was really interesting is that in October, the Partnership for Public Service, which is a good government nonprofit, issued a report that showed that whenever there is improvements in administrative routines, that translates into improvements of employee satisfaction and engagement, which in turn translates to improved customer satisfaction by the citizens that receive services. And that almost validates a report or a story that was done in Harvard Business Review maybe 35, 40 years ago, looking at Sears. And they realized that they focused on employee engagement, that they'll improve profits through customer satisfaction. So that's been sort of the big picture. The other thing that happened is that we were given a charter of producing recommendations within 6 months. But then Vice President Gore said after that 6 months was over, now we have to do it. And that took an additional 8 years.
Well, I came on the first week after it seemed like it was all set up in terms of leadership and teams in that time period between the election and the inauguration. Because when I came in, it was already very well organized. There were agency teams reinventing the Department of Defense, reinventing the Department of Education, reinventing the Department of Commerce, Department of Labor. So there were agency teams, but then there were also cross-cutting issue teams. So looking at how to update the use of technology in government. I was on the transforming organizational structures team. So there were agency teams and cross-cutting teams. And then like kind of what you're talking about, some of those big issues were put towards interagency teams. So there was a structure that I've carried through in other work that I've done that was really fascinating. You've talked about the how different administrations have dealt with government reform or improving performance and efficiencies. What are the legacies of reinventing government, and how did it change over the past administrations?
Well, the original report had about 350 recommendations with about 1,300 specific actions that would be taken. And I thought it was interesting that over the years there were nearly 100 pieces of legislation that acted on some of the items, but the things that seemed to stick were things that were actually not required in legislation, but rather were undertaken by the reinventing government team itself. One of them was the designation of the deputy secretaries as chief operating officers for each of the departments. Interestingly, up until then, there were no chief operating officers, which is common in the private sector. And then we convened the chief operating officers across the government into the President's Management Council. And the idea is they would then run the implementation of the reinvention initiative, but they needed a staff. And in a way, that's what the role of the ongoing reinventing government team was over the 8 years. The other, and it wasn't legislation, was that agencies were to create strategic plans as to where they wanted to go in coming years. interestingly, most agencies didn't have anything like that. Another was the creation of a government-wide one-stop website that's currently called USA.gov. And it's a place that citizens can go to find out about services in the government. When we were creating it, the question was, how do you organize it? And there was a competition between those who thought you needed to have an icon for each agency and let people go by agency, and another was let's go by services. So passport and information about recreation on parklands, etc., was to organize around what people cared about in government. And that was the element that kind of won out and when they organized the website. Another is this whole notion of focusing on customer service, or now it's called customer experience because it's looking at the entire life cycle of the thing. And so the current administration has been doing things like putting together kits for mothers for the birth of their children, and that kit had everything you needed in it. Like, how do you get your Social Security card? How do you get and since most of these are targeted towards low income people, how do you get onto food stamps and all these different things? Of what do you do to get maternal health care visits, all that sort of stuff. They are organizing things around disaster assistance that reach across agencies. It's not just FEMA, but the Department of Health and Human Services and Small Business Administration, et cetera. And another thing that's been going on is creating something around retirement and what are all the different services that are needed. So that effort that started back then continues today.
I think one of the most important innovations from reinventing government that seems to have lasted is really understanding how important cross-cutting agency cooperation is, and that the really important none of the important issues can be addressed unless there's cooperation across agencies, because everything's complicated, and whether you're talking about veterans issues or homelessness or hunger or what's going on with farmers, they cannot be solved by one agency alone. And so this the model of having the president's management agenda, of having those deputy secretaries meeting for the pretty much the first time ever, I think became the model for how you have leadership coordinate across agencies and address very specific issues, including disaster relief or preparation. So I think that was a very powerful innovation. Um, so not only did agencies not have chief operating officers, they didn't have cross-cutting interagency senior policy group meetings. So everything was so isolated, and I think that started to change with reinvention, and that's kept going as well.
But what's interesting is that President's Management Council tends to focus on administrative issues, like creating a government-wide security clearance process or improving hiring, as opposed to focusing on like implementing climate change legislation or other major legislation. That's actually happening, but it's not being done through the President's Management Council. It's being done through policy councils that in the White House, and I thought that's been an interesting evolution over time. As we weren't sure where this would evolve, and so there's like two sets of councils: one that on the how government should work, and the other one is on what government is doing.
Interesting, interesting. Um, okay, well, we have a new president, and Donald Trump and his supporter Elon Musk have been talking about government efficiencies and performance and how to improve all that. You've been doing this for nearly 50 years. What advice do you have for this new administration?
Well, there's a few points. One is that it isn't all about performance and efficiency, that there's a hunger for outcomes that matter to Americans, and also a desire for fairness for how government works. And those kinds of things need to be woven in. They can't be ignored. The other is that I think that values matter and how you see the world. So people use the word paradigm, but for example, do you see government as something not to be trusted? And if so, that means you need to have more controls. Or you could say you could use more transparency and make things more open. Do you trust employees to do the right things? If so, then you empower them to get their jobs done. If you not, then you put more controls on them. And but you have to be clear on your values and you need to act on them and understand there's potential consequences, good or bad. The second is um, government works very differently than the private sector. And if you look at the Ronald Reagan Grace Commission in the early 1980s, where he brought in private sector experts to fix the government, they typically ran into barriers because they didn't understand how government works. On the surface, it looks very similar. Like you have common administrative routines and acquisition or personnel or budgeting or customer service, but they're very different in reality as to how you act on them in government. You don't hear any stories, for example, about how Ford Motor Company was paralyzed and their workers were sent home because the board wouldn't approve the CEO's budget after months of negotiation. I mean, that just doesn't, nobody would ever believe that something would happen like, but that happens routinely in the federal government. There aren't any stories in the private sector about contracts taking 3 years to negotiate. And then after being awarded, they're appealed to vendors in the court, and like the defense service, cloud service contract, and then ultimately have the contract split 4 different ways after it's been appealed. I mean, you just that doesn't happen. If a contractor tried to contest the contract that was being given by a private company, they would just be cut off and not allowed to compete any further. There's no stories in the private sector about employees being suspended with pay and kept on administrative years for 4 years while their issues are being negotiated in administrative hearings. I mean, that just doesn't happen. And that is all common stories in the federal government. And so they have to, any reformers have to understand that the government works very, very differently, even in the common areas like in administrative things in government. So that's one of the things that I think that as a caution.
John, is there anything else you want to say about government reform and any more advice for the new administration?
Sure. Uh, History is basically littered with failed government reform efforts that are being led and staffed by outsiders. And it's because they don't understand that in government, there's a greater demand for accountability and to many different stakeholders, not just the president. There's demand to follow laws. There's so many laws, and they're not necessarily logical or businesslike. Making any significant changes in the executive branch really requires changing laws. You can't take decisive action like you can in the private sector. I just remember that when I moved to the private sector after leaving government, there was an email that said that there's going to be that there was a poor quarterly performance and there was going to be a 7% across the board pay cut. And it was just an email. There was no union demands. There was no hearings in Congress. I mean, there was nothing. It just was that. And you would never have something like that happen in government. The other thing is that ask career civil servants for their advice. They care about making government work better. And even when we were doing Reinventing Government, people were saying, you could cut my job because what I do really isn't essential. I mean, people will come out and say that because they care about how government works for the people. And they'll tell you where the cuts can be made. They don't like waste any more than you do.
I think the frontline folks were brilliant about cutting red tape. There was so much red tape that was cut. There were so many processes that were cleaned out. I think we threw out the entire 10,000-page federal personnel manual because it was incomprehensible. So the frontline workers really do have information and want to have government that works better for Americans. So
The other thing is that making recommendations is very different than implementing them. Look at the Trump reform plan that he prepared in 2019. It had major, breathtaking recommendations, and nothing happened. Uh, those most of those recommendations are never carried out because there was no concerted implementation effort, and most of them were thwarted by Congress. So, the idea of abolishing the Office of Personnel Management and moving the administrative functions over to the General Services Administration never happened. Both Clinton and George Bush efforts invested years into implementation, and they were far more successful than any externally driven efforts that were packed up in after publishing the reports. So,
So many things. I do strategic planning and I say, if you're doing a strategic plan, you have to have a roadmap for implementation. You cannot have one without the other. So I totally understand what you're saying. Thank you so much, John Kamensky.
thank you for the invite. I appreciate it.
Uh, this has been episode 2. Our next 2 episodes, 3 and 4, are going to look at veterans issues and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And then we're going to do an arc of 4 episodes about fishing, farming, ranching, and the state of America's food supply system. So lots to look forward to. Thank you so much, John. And for anyone who's interested, John posts weekly his summary of performance measures for government on his LinkedIn site, and we'll put all that information on the YouTube channel. Thank you again, John.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.